We've got a great lineup day. I guess it's day 3 for many of us that came in on Sunday for the pre-conference sessions. So we still have two great sessions, or really what equates to about 8 sessions later this morning, and then we have a closing plenary back in here to close out the session. But I want to jump right in because this is going to be a really great session this morning. And to really kick it off, I want to introduce Brian Flanagan, who's a shareholder and environmental attorney with Schwab, Williamson & Wyatt. He's been very active in the planning. I think he was in one session yesterday, 2 sessions? Just one session. But very active in this year's summit. And also Schwab is a partner and a sponsor of this year's summit as well. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Brian, and he's going to kick it off. And thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
All right.
Thank you. Sorry, I just got up here and saw what some of Nick's slides are, which I hadn't seen, and they're pretty funny. So again, I'm Brian Flanagan with Schwab Williamson, and why I'm up here right now is because when we were talking about this summit, about this conference, Greg asked me on the side, like, what's interesting? And I think he asked a number of people on the committee, what are we missing? What's interesting? And I reflected on the work I do, which is development of big projects. And I thought about the private projects. And what I thought about and what I reflected to Greg was every time you're doing a large development project, there's a public side to that. There's a public impact, there's a public infrastructure need. And we touch on that. All those breakout sessions are somehow touching on that. But let's bring that home on a keynote, and let's talk about that issue. These are two components that support one another, that private infrastructure and the public infrastructure. And I'm looking out right now at Sean Clark and Paula Miranda, and we have a great example where it was 7 or 8 years ago, they knew they had a great asset in their dock outside of Clatskanie. And I was working for a private entity, one of their tenants, and supporting the port, who was on the public side, getting funding and working on making that dock, supporting that dock structurally to be able to support larger vessels for imports and exports. That public-private development has now led to others coming to the port to look to develop. And right now they've got a lease with a renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel facility to develop there as well, and continue to use that public access, that public dock, to further their mission and to support their community. These kind of projects I see in Malheur County, mining projects in Jackson, Columbia County, in marine terminals in Lincoln, Lincoln was gold, in Morrow County, wood products in Lane County, in the renewable fuels I talked about in Columbia, and also in Lake County. And you see these public-private partnerships or the working in symbiosis happening all over. And it's critical for us. But what's the issue? The issues are the chicken and egg. What I've written down here is the field of dreams. If you build it, will they really come? And that's always the question. Because you know who came calling first in Field of Dreams? It was Timothy Busfield, the gosh darn brother-in-law, saying, what are you doing? You need that corn to pay your bills. The bankers were next with their foreclosure letters. It took believing in that dream of that public infrastructure all the way until Ray Liotta came out with the whole team, and then the carloads of people came and paid. And I see the Field of Dreams fans out there, and they're following my analogy here. And today we've got Nick Green coming to us, who's really been that Kevin Costner to the Timothy Busfields of the world, coming in and trying to figure out the ways to create public infrastructure that will support the development of his community. And Nick Nick comes with a great background for this. He started out with Booz Allen and Jacobs doing consulting work and doing a lot of that logistics and business consulting. And when he switched over, got his master's degree, and came to John Day, which is his wife's family home. That's part of a community that he was coming into. And he brought that consulting mentality to it. He assessed the situation. He essentially audited the situation and said, what are our strengths here? We've got a community that has lost its main, like so many communities that we all work in and live in, lost the wood products industry. We've seen that decline. And he said, but what do we have? What are the assets we have? How can we support this and support that and grow this? And then he went about developing the infrastructure to support that. Nick has raised over $30 million in public investment capital for housing and community development. That's impressive. This is in John Day. And by the way, I love the Field of Dreams analogy, because when I go to John Day, it's beautiful the way the director of Field of Dreams made Iowa cornfields. I've been in Iowa cornfields. They don't look like that. Does like John Day. But anyhow, that was aside. Nick has done an exceptional job of bringing new opportunities, hydroponic growth, agricultural growth, support for the wood products industry that's in the community. Bringing in, and I know he's going to talk about this, 3D home construction, 3D printing home construction. These are innovative new things that he's bringing to this community in thought leadership and innovation in the public sector. At the same time, and what we're talking about here, one of the things we're talking about today, what is the current calculus? And at the same time, he's had to face community involvement and continuing to keep community support as they work to get these projects across the finish line. How do you communicate that? And I know a lot of you guys in the public sector have to face that all the time. How do we continue to keep the public informed of this and understanding? And so Nick's going to be able to give us lots of insight on how he's worked with John Day to get that public funding, to build this public infrastructure, and to continue the discussion with the community. And so if we can put our hands together and invite Nick up to the stage, I'd like to.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Oh, thank you, Brian, for that great introduction. Awesome to be here. This is my favorite conference. Don't tell League of Oregon Cities. I love that one too. But I've come to this one for the last 4 years, virtually and in person, because I love to talk about infrastructure. I'm very passionate about this subject. This is the heavy lifting. So thanks, Brian, for that great introduction. I think he chose the title of this keynote, and it's a very accurate title. This is the calculus. So it's early morning. We're going to go through some heavy math. I want to get your brain juices flowing. So I'm going to ask the hardest question of the day up front. Are you ready? Okay, what does your aging infrastructure look like? The picture on the left or the picture on the right? You ready for it? There we go. Think hard about this one, right? We all have aging infrastructure. We want it to look like the gentleman on the left, like I can go forever. But for a lot of us, we're like the lovely lady on the right who, if you've seen that GIF or that YouTube video, she goes to blow out the candle on her 102nd birthday and her teeth fall out. That is pretty accurate for John Day's public infrastructure. We are on borrowed time, and I guess the point here is regardless of how you look or how you perceive your own infrastructure, none of it is immortal. None of it is going to live forever. It all needs to eventually be replaced. We need to start planning for that. So I realize I'm talking to a highly educated and experienced group of policymakers and practitioners and consultants and government bureaucrats, the tired 12. So recognizing you're all very, very smart, I do want to hopefully leave you with some new information. It may not be new to all of you, but to try and help us kind of get on the same page about what are these things we call P3s, how do they work, and where can I go to learn more? So I would consider Governing's Guide essential reading if you're interested in doing public-private partnerships, or you just want a better way to communicate public sector finance. There's 4 volumes. They started out with 3. They added a 4th. My public finance professor at the University of Washington co-wrote these, Justin Marlowe. But the last 2 focus specifically on P3s, what they are, how you create them, and basically the risks and rewards that we're seeing in the market today. So I would recommend you take some time. They're free to download. You may have to give up your email address to get them, but take the time to read through those because I think they'll provide you with some good information. And I'm going to pull a definition right out of that book. What are these public-private partnerships? In a nutshell, these are long-term agreements between a government or public sector agency, it could be a special district in Oregon, and the private sector to share risks and reward to deliver an essential public service. And I like that they called it a public service. Not everything that is a P3 is infrastructure. Most are, but some also include alternative service delivery models for operating and maintaining infrastructure, not just for creating it. So how do you structure these? What do they look like? I love models like this because they're fun to break. So these are examples, call them base cases for what a P3 could be. But the fun part is when you get into these and you start deal making, you get to create your own adventure. You get to negotiate with your private partners. You get to negotiate between your public partners. And really what you're going to end up coming up with is some type of a hybrid that probably started out with one of these approaches but ended up becoming its own unique thing. And for me, that's really the fun, is getting a chance to create these negotiated agreements where people come out feeling more or less like they're getting what they wanted out of the project. None of them are perfect, but I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples. One is your traditional public sector procurement. This is what we're all familiar with. This, government comes up with a project, they design a project, they put that project out for bid, private sector comes in and builds it, and then the government operates it, maintains it, and runs it into the ground. Just kidding. What we run into are capacity issues, right? Our government employees don't tend to be experts in operating high-dollar equipment. And so with staff turnover and over time, especially in our smaller cities, which, by the way, is at least half of them, half of Oregon cities have 3,000 people or less, they lose that technical expertise. The initial training starts to wear. But that's your traditional approach. And then you start to look at some of these P3 models. One is design, build, operate, maintain, where the government essentially manages the project. Private sector designs it, operates it, and maintains it. The government comes in with financing. And then there's the joint ventures, which are very elegant structures and kind of hard to pull off. But that's basically where you're sharing the risk. I won't say equally, but you try to get the incentives to align. You're sharing the risk and the reward. And you typically pursue these for things that have the potential to make money. Example would be like a stadium. You can do it for public utilities, but a lot of our utilities are designed to break even. And so joint ventures aren't as common in that sphere. And then there's one that, this is one example that we've done, joint venture P3. We attempted to do this with broadband. We were going to create a hybrid organization with public sector funding, private funding. We submitted that proposal to the Economic Development Administration. Wes Cochran's in the room. Great guy, love Wes. First contact with EDA at the local level, everyone was really excited. Contact with the national office, kill it dead. We cannot have these things. You can't come into us and say, we need $2 million, and we've already identified a private partner who's going to operate and maintain this because it's not a competitive procurement. And I'm like, well, no, duh. We didn't want to do a competitive procurement. We live in John Day. Have you ever been here? There's exactly one service provider. So what are we doing? Are we going to go out and pretend that there are others and we'll go through the competitive solicitation and all the rigmarole of a procurement and all 34 of the special award conditions just to demonstrate that we did our due diligence to show you what we already knew on the day we applied? And the answer from EDA's national office was, yes, that's exactly what you're going to do. So we took our 34 special award conditions and we're working through $2 million of federal funding. And we're going to implement sort of a backward version of this where we do all of those things that I just described. We put it out for competitive bid. We get our one bidder, who is the company we proposed with, and then we end up signing the exact same agreement that we wanted to start out with. You can probably detect a little bit of sarcasm in my voice. I love our federal partners. They're great. A lot of the bureaucracy is just as frustrated as we are with all of these stupid rules. So we got to fix it. I sat through a great session yesterday. We talked about a $23 billion deficit just in water infrastructure for the state of Oregon. We will not close that gap following the same broken model that we've implemented over the last 50 years. And I'm glad this is being recorded because I'm standing by that statement. We will not close that gap doing business as usual. And we have to close it. It's more than just safety of our communities. It's viability, long-term viability of our communities. If we want to keep Oregon's towns and cities unique, and that's what I love about this state. Each town you go to has its own unique character and identity. It's got its own unique history. But if we want to achieve equitable outcomes, if we want to achieve sustainability, if we want viable futures for these communities, we cannot follow outdated and old thought models. So P3s are an avenue. I think they're a great approach. I will talk about brownfield redevelopment because we're doing one right now, which is brownfield privatization. I'm biased because that's the one that's working the best of all the P3s that we've structured. It's also been by far the most fun. So I'm going to show some videos and I'll do a little bit of a deep dive on that one. And I thought I'd start off with that. You've heard about this thing we call the John Day Innovation Gateway. What is it? Well, it depends on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to a regulator, it's one tiny little project sitting right in the middle of a brownfield, and it's nothing else. That is our area of potential effect. Thou shalt not regulate anything outside of that area of potential effect. They're not buying the argument that we're trying to make. The challenge here is when you start to blend projects and you're blending capital stacks and you're pulling in sources of funding from multiple locations and you're leveraging one project against another. These are best practices from a public sector finance standpoint. Get as much capacity out of your financing as you can. Get as much leverage out of each project that you implement as you can. The problem is the rules aren't designed to support that. They like very discrete projects where you can just deal with one thing at a time, permit that thing cradle to grave, and then come in and do another thing. And so when you start to wrap value into these equations, the rules collide. And you get federal bureaucracies that end up in these strange internecine conflicts with each other over whose rules trump the other agencies, who's lead, who's not. I could talk at length about that, but I don't want to discourage you from trying what we're trying to do. I'm just having the honest discussion that right now, this is really hard. So the Innovation Gateway started out as a brownfield redevelopment project in John Day. I was out for a run with my buddies one morning early in 2017, and I'm looking over at the former Oregon Pine Mill site, and I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. But this is the entrance to John Day. It sits right at the corner of the city entrance, and it was an abandoned timber mill. And it basically screamed, we're dead here. Go away, turn around, drive back. There's nothing happening in this town. And I was looking at it and said, what a wonderful opportunity for us. I wonder if we could get our hands on this property. So I called Valerie Johnson at DR Johnson Lumber, who was the owner, and I said, would you be interested in selling this to us? Could we work out a deal? And it was a lot of tense negotiating. Another third party got into the mix when they saw that a public agency was interested, trying to, I would say leverage that against another thing, and it just got complicated. But the long story short is we were able to acquire it, and we closed the deal at $9,800 an acre. It has a quarter of a mile highway frontage, a mile of riverfront running through the center of it, $9,800 an acre. I felt pretty good about that. I thought we did pretty well. It was a brownfield. They'd gone through the voluntary brownfield cleanup program in 2009. They got a no further action decision for the extent of the mill, let's say the mill contamination that existed at the time. If you've done brownfield redevelopment, you know not all NFAs are created equal. You still have to do site characterization for your proposed use. And of course, at that time, they didn't have a proposed use. They were trying to clean up what they had done. So we came in with this concept called the Innovation Gateway. And the basic idea was we're going to take this available land area. A lot of it, even though it was adjacent to the river, was elevated out of the floodplain. And we're going to create an economic model around this land. So revitalization, urban renewal. We worked with a fantastic team. The economics were led by Echo Northwest. We had Walker Macy as our landscape architect. DKS was our transportation engineer. A really fantastic team. We did this under Oregon's Transportation Growth Management Grant. So it was jointly funded by ODOT and DLCD, as well as the city of John Day. And as part of that, we created an investor prospectus. Now, this is not the type of prospectus you would file in an S1. It's a pitch deck. But it was basically to showcase our community. So all of this content is online. You can see it on the City of John Day website. We also created, through a partner agency, Strata Gold, Benjamin Arif is the founder, he's here today, discoverjohnday.com, which is a website that just showcases all of these different projects. So if you have a minute, you want to learn more, I would definitely recommend you go there. But this was our approach, and I'll show you sort of the highlights of where we started and where we've gone with this project. Another P3 was our broadband that I mentioned earlier. We won on one of the early rounds of USDA Reconnect, $6 million to do middle mile throughout Grant County. We're in one of the least equipped broadband counties in Oregon. And then followed that up with investment funding of almost $2 million from the EDA. And what we're doing with these public funds is working with the local internet service provider. We contributed $1 million in cash from the city through a state appropriation as the public sector contribution. We own the infrastructure within the city. They own the middle mile. How's that for complicated? They own the transport, we own the local distribution. We maintain the infrastructure, they operate the infrastructure and pay us a lease fee for the broadband network. We also get the franchise fees from the new customers. They get the profit. That was the hybrid agreement that we worked out. In addition, we were able to negotiate 4 points of presence throughout the county where we would have gigabit symmetrical drops for use by the public for any purpose that is not directly in competition with them as a service provider. So throughout this county, and this is the synopsis of 4 years of very diligent planning and development, we now have gigabit fiber running to each town and a full build out of John Day that's fully funded and designed, and we're going through the permitting process to install that now. Yeah, thank you. That was a labor of love. As part of our brownfield project, we also started working on a concept for reclaimed water. Our new wastewater treatment plant reclaims 100% of its water, treats it to Class A. It will reduce our freshwater consumption by about 35%, just allowing us to repurpose for non-potable sources or uses, for example, like watering your lawn. But of the remaining balance, we have about 80 million gallons of water a year that we're generating in this small town. And so our thought was, can we create an economic engine with this investment? And what would we do with the reclaimed water? So we built this greenhouse as a proof of concept. It's owned and operated by the city of John Day. I'm going to fast forward to some pictures. This launched just as COVID was launching, so that's an interesting time to be a government startup, which is in and of itself an interesting thing to be. So we're running a government startup enterprise out of our public works department to distribute fresh produce to restaurants that closed, to grocery stores that became anemic, and to consumers that were afraid to leave their houses. It was a dilemma, and just like a private company, we had to pivot very quickly. So our initial go-to-market strategy was we're going to sell to our wholesale provider first so that we're not undercutting price in the market, and then we'll go to the restaurants, and then we'll go to consumer for whatever's left over. Within about 3 months, we flipped that operating model on its head. We went direct to consumer through johndaygreenhouse.com for about 90% of our distribution. People paid online through the website we created on Square. They came and just picked up their fresh produce and took it home with them. There was no contact, no cash transactions took place. That's the way we operated for the first 12 months. Then we went to the restaurants and then to the wholesale provider. But this was a great example of what we could do, repurposing land within this brownfield to try and create economic value. And the way we defined economic value was increased profitability for our businesses, which we were able to sell below their regular pricing and deliver a higher quality product. Increased efficiency. We didn't have to import or export. We could do everything locally. And improved quality of life. And that third one is really important. Not all projects the government takes on need to make money. Some of them can be NPV negative. My finance professor said governments exist to make NPV negative investments. We take on the stuff the private sector is not willing to do. But there needs to be a return on investment. And in some cases, that return on investment is improved quality of life. Happier people who are better off. That is a fundamental role of government: health, welfare, safety of the public. So we were able to create 250 very happy customers who are getting the top shelf produce at very affordable prices that was locally grown. So this was a community-supported agriculture project. And then we started looking at other retail opportunities. We tried to get a hotel to invest and had them on the hook, and then they wriggled away and ended up investing in Madras. Excited for Madras. Was a little disappointed for us. But we ended up finding a local company willing to expand along the John Day River at the Innovation Gateway site. And they're going to create the 1188 Destinations Distillery, Lodgery, and Eatery. They're a microbrewery downtown that's going to expand and create a storefront along the riverfront. So this will be a privately operated enterprise within this area that's been publicly created. It'll have Airbnbs, think McMenamins, but with a rural flair. So I want to show you some pictures, historic pictures of that site. This was the Oregon Pine Mill in the 1950s on the bottom right, and an aerial shot just at the heyday of the mill in the early 1990s before it closed. So you can see a lot on that 53-acre property, a lot of lumber had been stacked and was ready for processing. And I'm going to exit out of my presentation and see if I can minimize that and show you a video of what it looks like today. And this was developed by Strata Gold, but I want to show you where we're going with it. So we're standing at the site of the former Oregon Pine Mill. And when this building shut down in the early 1990s, that really signaled the collapse of the timber industry as a mainstay employer in John Day. And so we went from a very booming and robust economy to almost flatlined. But then we started to act. We recognized that we needed to think differently and we needed to invest differently to stem that decline. 5 years ago, John Day launched what we call our strategy for growth. About 15 capital improvement projects, and we have raised $23 million in grant funding. And so in conjunction with those economic development plans, we actually purchased this site. It was the first of 4 land acquisitions the city made that have netted about 100 acres of land with the John Day River running through the center. And we went through a 2-year area planning process to create what we're calling the John Day Innovation Gateway and Riverfront Recreation Area. So this is a 100-acre redevelopment zone. We've gone through multiple rounds of brownfield remediation, and we are now doing both horizontal improvements, water, sewer infrastructure, fiber optics, but also vertical construction. At this location, we operate a 6,000 square foot hydroponic greenhouse that produces about 10 tons of fresh, locally grown produce annually. And that's an effort to create a more sustainable and food secure community. And in conjunction with that, we're operating a new wastewater treatment plant that will reclaim 100% of our wastewater and repurpose it for that industry. So we're using assets that already exist in this community and rearranging them in new ways that improve our quality of life, that create greater economic value, and increase the profitability of our businesses and the efficiency of our government agencies, and that's really what innovation means. So we are leading the state in innovating from the perspective of rural agriculture. Thank you. I've actually never shown a video of me talking while I was talking. So if that was weird for you, it was weird for me too. Let's see if I can get this to pop back up. All right. But I like, you probably sense the passion here, the heart and soul that's gone into these projects to be able to take back your future for a small town in Oregon. And that is a story that needs to be told in a lot of small towns in Oregon. We have so much to offer, but our way of life eroded. You picture yourself standing on the coast. You picture your favorite beach in Oregon. You're standing out there, and you're right in the surf as it comes up on the sand. And what happens to your feet as the ocean goes out again? You feel that sand eroding from underneath you, and you sink. That's kind of what happened when the timber industry started to get overregulated and we really clamped down on environmental controls. They felt like the sand was coming out from under their feet and they'd lost their foundation. But instead of acting, they just got really angry. And they the federal government, and what can we occupy, and who can we kill? And it was ineffective. We're better than that. So we're gonna show some examples of how do we overcome or how do we bridge these gaps. And I'm gonna start walking around a little bit because that's good for my feet. This is my slide. I won't claim any intellectual capital. You're welcome to use it or not if it's useful to you. This is kind of my vision of how we take on a project in Oregon and what's working and what isn't. So picture yourself standing down here in the bottom left and looking up to the top of a very steep mountain, covered in clouds. You can barely see the top of it. Some of our local public officials are going to stand down there and they're going to look up there and they're going, I don't know if I want to climb that. It looks pretty tall. It looks like a lot of work. And the view down here at base camp is pretty cool too. So I'm just going to hang out down here. Some projects die at the concept stage. Some of them should die at the concept stage. But the reality is if you want to do something in Oregon, it is a lot of work. So you got to be ready to climb and you need partners to climb it with you. But as you move forward, and you start putting in more effort, the reward increases. And so what I kind of say is your first fitness peak, the first hill you've got to surmount, is going from concept to plan. Now, depending on your jurisdiction and your purview, that might mean you have a plan set in front of a local planning commission that gets approved and survives appeal. So you've arrived. Or for some jurisdictions, it's, hey, we created a housing needs assessment or a housing production strategy. Oops, and they're like, we did it. We've got it. We've succeeded. And then you're like, you have built none housing. Total reward to date is a pile of paper that nobody may ever read. It's not to devalue what you've done. Just don't think you've arrived because you haven't. You started the journey. So unfortunately, for a lot of local jurisdictions, that's where it ends. They come up with a plan, the plan gets approved. We heard a great example of the Mater plan. It was supposed to be master plan yesterday for the original Prineville wastewater treatment plant, but they forgot to put the S in, and that was adopted without the S on the cover sheet. I thought that was a great story, right? Like, we did it. You didn't. So Valley of Death number one, you got a bridge from concept plan to biddable plan set, an actual solicitable work product with preliminary design. Usually that means you're at 90 to 100% design drawings. There's a lot of technical capacity to get from vision to approved plan to design plan. So P3s are one way to bridge that gap. There's certainly other ways. We've got to look at capacity building statewide, and we also need to deregulate and start looking at simpler ways to get from study to a biddable plan set. But once we cross that bridge, unfortunately, we're still not done. Now we're in the hunt. Now we have a product to shop, but depending on your market, your location, the timing, you still don't necessarily have your permits to construct. You don't have your construction team or your development team in place. You may still have a few entitlement issues you've got to get through before you finally arrive, in this example, for housing production at owner-occupied or renter-occupied housing. So that second Valley of Death is putting a team together capable of going from this is the construction drawings to success, we've got a plan. So I'm showing you that as a thought model. There's another one that I want to show you. Oh, I forgot I have a clicker. Yeah, firing on all cylinders today, everyone. This is one I actually got out of business school in technology entrepreneurship. I had a great serial entrepreneur come and present, and he said, this is what I use: test, validate, scale. And so think about this in terms of not just projects, but also policy innovation and management entrepreneurship, because we've got to innovate not just in projects and in techniques, but across the spectrum of how we operate. So the idea was, I'm going to test, in his case, he was testing a certain pizza chain. He said, I'm going to test this in 3 very distinct markets with 3 very different products, and I'm going to see, and I'm going to switch them around between those 3. I'm going to see what the public responds to. What are people interested in? And then when I've tested that and I've found what I think is the right go-to-market approach, the right basket of goods that people want, I'm going to validate that by moving it into other markets. And I'm going to assess it there. And then when I've worked out the kinks in those, I will scale the enterprise. That was the owner and his wife of Mod Pizza. And that was the second company they launched. There's Mod Pizzas everywhere now. It started out with 3 in the Seattle area. But I really loved what they said, because we need to create a safe harbor for policy innovation in the state. And that does not start with a rule book that cites OAR XYZ. We have to create space for us to experiment if we're going to achieve the outcomes that we want. And we also need to recognize that there are outcomes that we don't want. And how do we kill those? So I love Marcus Lyon's work. Look him up. He's a great artist. He put together some very thought-provoking images that I'd like to share this one with you. Who would like to live here? Some people would, right? I mean, here's the reality, folks. This is where we're headed. Is that where we want to go? It's not where I want to go. But that's where we're headed, and we're heading that way because we keep doing the same things we've always done. So he created these brick pieces to show examples of what will happen with unregulated growth, but also recognizing that this last decade we saw a turning point in our nation's history, a net decline in population in rural communities overall, which is pretty frightening. He also showed this one. Of course, this predates Elon Musk's launch of Starlink. I think he'd probably go a different direction with it today. But just another example of what will happen if we don't innovate. You know, if we keep scaling the same solutions over and over again, we'll have skies filled with the same airplanes that are operating in the same way they've always operated. So the idea here to further provoke your thought juices this morning. Some things need to die. We've got to create disruption. I wrote a paper that got me in a little bit of trouble as a grad student called Death of a County. And it was invoking Death of a Salesman. And if you look at the subscript, Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman, addresses themes of loss of identity, nostalgia for the past, and our inability to accept change within ourselves and society. How many of you would say that defines or characterizes your community or your county or your sphere of influence? I will. Being the disruptor is not fun. You're going to take a lot of heat. I've been called a carpetbagger. I've been threatened so many times I've lost track. I really don't care anymore. It doesn't even have an impact on me. They'll come at you. Ooh, sorry. We still on? They will come at you if you disrupt the status quo. Who is the they? It depends on where you live. But the point is, if you're going to disrupt, you're going to draw some heat. But I love humor can dispel a lot. I love the New Yorker. The doctor. Well, I'm going to go over here. Doctor telling his patient, living longer may not be right for you. We've got to be prepared to abandon some of these time-honored and cherished traditions that just aren't working for us in favor of things that might truly frighten us. This is my ecosystem slide for how we're going to create 20 homes in Burns by the end of next year. So we're calling it 20 and 23. How do you build 20 houses in a rural community that's built an average of about 1 every 3 years? you do something that looks this messy. You get with Doug Dalton at Baker Technical and you say, how do we train and bring in your student workforce to do land development and education in real time? Can we bring in our 3D home printers and actually get 3D home printing construction companies invested in rural Oregon? We've done that twice. You put together a development group who's capable of accessing capital. You hire a planner, somebody like me, but hopefully better, who can come in and really crank it up on your planning application and get you through the entitlement process in 90 days or less. And then you start pulling in all of your incentives, your enterprise tax credits, your investment credits, your urban renewal, and you start layering these until you find the sweet spot where the private sector is willing to invest. There are more elegant frameworks, and I just wanted to highlight one, which is Growing Rural Oregon, sponsored by the Ford Family Foundation. You can look it up. I helped them create this model with a couple of other fantastic consultants and practitioners. Sean Irvin out of Independence was part of this group, K2 out of Kansas. And we kind of struggled to come up with how do you create these ecosystem frameworks. So I won't dwell on that because I am getting a bit short of time. But I would like to sort of conclude and then open it up for discussion with an example of the Ridge, which is the first 3D printed development. And I'm going to show a quick video of how we got to these 3D homes, what the site looks like today, and then I'll take questions if we have time. So you minimize here and pull up a website, and with a little bit of luck, this will actually work.
John Day, population 1,735. Not the most likely place to launch a revolution.
So far, you haven't been afraid of going first.
Right here in John Day, Oregon.
These will be the first 3D printed homes in Oregon. It'll be the first 3D printed homes in the Pacific Northwest.
A housing revolution. And yes, that man said 3D printed homes. Homes that are made like this. A computer-driven gantry system applying layer after layer of cement to form walls that will be topped with wood truss-supported metal roofs, and soon to be printed right here. At least that is the current vision for the city of John Day, the architect and the developer who walked the site with us.
We need housing, and let's try it. You know, if it works, there's a huge opportunity here.
They came to us and asked if we would be interested in being a part of it, and we just said absolutely.
The city will contribute $700,000 for neighborhood infrastructure, with the understanding some of the units will address the need for low and middle income housing.
Efficiency of space.
And developers have agreed to give computer printing a shot. They're targeting a rent of $750 a month.
We'd love to see if that technology can pencil, and we'd love to see if it can put houses up and provide housing, faster and than we have been doing in traditional ways.
Printing the units could cut construction time and costs, with labor and materials expensive and in short supply.
Ease and speed of construction, if that all plays out, can be huge, and the ability to move this operation to the next pad or the next spot on the same site and do it all over again.
But initially, we're looking at 4 triplexes. There's 2 different floor plans. There's a 2-bedroom with 2 studios, that's 1 floor plan, and then 3 1-bedroom units.
Alquist 3D, just one in a growing field of home printing companies, is the likely but not yet confirmed contractor.
Yes, you're very much on the cutting edge, which is good and bad. It's good that you get to be first and you get to create the best practices, which is really exciting. It's bad that you get to create the best practices and you can't learn from others.
The technology is in its infancy. Proponents say printed homes will be stronger, more energy efficient, easier and cheaper to customize, and importantly, more fire resistant than so-called stick-built structures.
Our homes don't burn, which is a big reason why we're coming to Oregon.
Everyone involved with this project knows they are taking a risk. There's still so many questions about how and whether this will work.
What does it truly cost? Is it going to be cheaper this time than a conventional stick-framed house? Who knows? My thought is probably not the first time.
If it does work here in John Day, plans are to move the concept and the printing machine to Burns for a similar project, and then to Lakeview. The cities have joined in a rare 3-way civic partnership as a way of leveling and sharing the expenses of design, development, and construction. So the revolution begins, possibly as early as June, on this hilly piece of property on the east end of John Day, where there is a mix of giddy optimism
Right developers, right city, and the right technology at the right time.
and cautious pragmatism
You have to do it. You have to test it, you have to validate it before you can scale it.
about the printable future of home construction in the rural West.
You want to scale success, you don't want to scale problem.
In John Day, I'm Alan Schaffler, Central Oregon Daily News.
All right. I like that video because I'm not in it. But also because it shows you something very rare and I think very important. Government bureaucrats being honest about the likelihood of success, about the challenges that are in front of us, about what it takes to succeed in innovating. We need more of that. So that was filmed back in April. This is October. We have all of the streets up to grade within the development, all of the horizontal infrastructure in the ground, fiber, water, sewer, everything's ready to go. We've missed our window of paving. We were hoping to be vertical in the 3D home printing this fall. They are going to print. They're scheduled to come out in mid-December with a climate-controlled tent. We're going to put that big tent, it'll look like a circus, over the top of the 3D printer, and we're going to print, and then we'll come back in the spring and pave. So my parting thought for you to inspire you further, when I'm stuck, I go to my favorite regional manager of a mid-sized paper company in northeastern United States, Michael Scott. I knew exactly what to do, but also in a much more real sense, I had no idea what to do. That's how it should feel when you're engaged in public-private development. You know what to do, but you also don't know what to do. So you got to get in there, you got to get in the fight, you got to make it work. And with that, I'll just conclude and say thank you for the time.
Nick, do you have time for questions?
Well, I think we're good for 10 minutes, maybe? Okay. Any questions? Don't ever come back here again and say those words. I'm kidding. Rich.
Hold on here, we'll get you.
Thank you, Nick. Always a pleasure to see you. If I understood correctly, you're going to have a little surplus treated water in the near future. And we spoke a little today, or you spoke a little today about private-public partnerships. And I just sent you some information about a company here in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Equilibrium Capital. And they are the largest controlled environment food producer in the United States, or one of the largest. And I suspect they would love to partner with John Day's treated effluent, and produce more healthy food for your community. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Rich. We actually started out, first of all, he said a very important thing. We live in the arid desert of Eastern Oregon, and we have an excess of water. I mean, yes, right? Where do I sign? We need that, but to drive new industry growth. So thank you. We did a proof of concept that just about was able to feed our entire community with a private partner scaling that and able to distribute. Imagine a world in which all of our cities are self-reliant. They can produce their own water. They can produce and treat their own waste and recycle it. They can grow their own food to meet the needs of their own community. I like regional interdependence. I'm very afraid of globalization. So, hopefully some of these thoughts will start triggering what can I do in my community. Any other questions? No takers. Okay, thank you.
Do you have a question?
Oh, Brian.
You mentioned the idea of innovation and trying to find areas where that can be public policy and infrastructure incubation, kind of rethinking the regulatory structure. Have you given any thought to how that could occur?
Yeah, I have, and I tend to come from the lens of rural because the rural, honestly, in a lot of ways has less constraints than urban. We don't have a lot of built environment we have to work around. We have a lot of green fields. So My thought is a state of suspended animation where we can push pause on all the rules for a moment. Now, this isn't real, but let me think it out through. Push pause on all the rules, something like a placemaking challenge, right? So if you took your local teams and you said, what can we create? What is the thing that we need most? What is going to be the best thing for our community? And you let them iterate on that and come up with a goal, a plan, an approach. And then you went back to the regulatory environment and said, how do we get to yes on this killer idea? That would be my approach. And then create something, in Russia it would be the Politburo. I don't know what the equivalent is here, the e-board. They won't appreciate that analogy. But a group, an extra legislative group, who could come in and say, all right, yeah, we're going to redline out these rules that just don't really make sense for this particular situation. We're going to permit it anyway. And we're going to create that flexibility within the system so that we can achieve the greater good without sacrificing the values that all the rulemaking were intended to accomplish, but somehow we got lost in the corn maze of various regulations and can't seem to find our way out. So I like placemaking challenges as one approach, and then backtracking into the regulations rather than starting in the land of no and trying to figure out how to get through it. Just to close that thought out, I worked for the first 12 years of my career for the intelligence community. I worked for the Pentagon. When we went into Iraq and Afghanistan in 2003, we did not have the technology we needed for our troops. We didn't have handheld biometrics readers, we didn't have persistent surveillance, we didn't have counter ID. And the normal fielding timeline for a piece of technology to a soldier is 10 years. So we had to go back to Congress, we had to go back to the Pentagon and say, we've got to come up with an accelerated process to deliver this technology where, when, and how it's needed. And they did. They created an alternative acquisition framework where we could deploy technology after going through minimal safety testing, put it in the hands of soldiers in theater for the operational testing, let them evaluate it in real time, send us feedback, and then we would adapt within the bureaucracy to either improve on that technology, sustain it as it is, or cut it. So if the Pentagon can do it, Oregon can do it. It's just a matter of defining the mission as success rather than following the rules.
Another question? All right, I got one more. I'm not letting you off the stage, which is one of the things that comes up in all of these projects is community involvement. That's clearly a portion of the calculus. You've had to deal with that in multiple ways. Can you tell us anything about your development on that? What you see as the current best practice?
I wish there were best practices. We have a fractured society. We have a highly polarized society. It's bad nationally, it's bad in Oregon, it's getting increasingly bad at the local level. So community is something we need to continue to strive for while recognizing that you are not going to satisfy everyone. Where we can be respectful is giving them a voice in the process and making sure they understand that we did hear you. But hearing someone does not mean that their ideas are sound or implementable or even rational. So respect the public, give them the opportunity to speak, and then do your best to help them understand that even though we're not necessarily doing what you suggest or recommend, it's not because we don't value you as a member of the community. It's because we feel strongly we need to go in a different direction. It's not a great answer. I wish there were a better answer, but I think that's probably as good as it's going to get for now. All right. Okay, I'm off the stage. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Nick, for a very thoughtful presentation. Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you are in your approach to these kind of sessions, and I really appreciate that effort. We have about a 30-minute break, so this is a good chance to visit with some of those sponsors and vendors in the back and take some time to get some more coffee and do some networking. And then about 30 minutes, the breakout sessions around the hall. We'll be back in here for the closing plenary here a little bit later today. Thank you.